Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session for the Climate Intervention Network for Early Career Researchers. My name is Cody Scahan. I'm one of the organizers of this panel. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford in anthropology, and my research focuses on carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal and public perception of those two things in Iceland. But I'm also doing an ARIA-funded project on stakeholder perception and engagement in the Arctic and the UK around SRM and other climate intervention technologies. Today we have a lovely fishbowl discussion format prepared for you guys, where we'll first hear from a few of the early career researchers in the Climate Intervention Network, and then we'll have an open discussion with questions for the panelists from the audience and from us, and perhaps if we get to it, a few questions for the audience to answer that we have prepared. So I think it's an exciting session, and I'm looking forward to it. And so, yeah, for our presenters, first we're going to start with Trisha Patel. And Trisha Patel is a research assistant at the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. Her work sits at the intersection of climate science, equity, and emerging climate interventions, with a particular focus on SRM through stratospheric aerosol injection. Then we'll have Ellen Haslati. I practiced that. She is the head of communications for Apparatia Arctis, building energy around a new age climate strategy to combat tipping points and explore climate interventions. With a master's degree in social science, she has developed understandings of the intersections of environmental and socio-technical change from the point of view of different knowledge systems. And then we'll have Rachel Neef, who is a second-year PhD researcher at the Adelaide Law School. I think third year, kind of? You finished your second year?
Let's say second.
Okay, we'll say second year. Her PhD thesis explores lessons from the space law regime for future solar radiation modification governance. And before they come up and speak, I'm going to introduce Clara Bato and have her talk about why she convened the network.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Sorry, I have my back turned towards some of you. But yeah, the idea of the fishbowl is that when we get to a more interactive part of the session, we're in this circle that's not as intimidating as someone just standing there in the front. So nice to meet you all. I'm Clara. I'm originally from Brazil, but I've been based in Europe for the past years. I work at DSG, that's the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. And amongst the many things that we do, we thought it was important to have a space where early career researchers and professionals at large could have a dedicated space to interact with people from their same generation who are either struggling with the same research challenges or have the same questions and worries about climate intervention, because we know it's not the easiest topic, especially when the climate crisis brings so many anxiety-inducing conversations. So Cody said that Clara convened, but we basically just provided this space for people to get together. And it's about, I think now we have over 100 people. Not all of them are researchers, but people interested in learning more about climate intervention technologies. And it's a work in progress. I mean, this is something that people also co-create and shape it the way that we decide we want the network to be shaped. And I mean, there will come a point where we're not early career researchers anymore, right? So it's also about, yeah, when we get to the third year or the fourth year. So there's also this legacy that we will somehow create for the next intake of early career researchers. So we'll see. It will be a ride, and yeah, I'm happy to be with all of you here today. Before I pass on the floor to Trisha, before you tell us what your work is about, I guess I'd be interested to know from each of you here in the inner circle, how you got into this topic and what motivates you to still be in it. Because I guess lots of people hear about it for the first time and then they're like, oh no, this is too much. I'm gonna do something else. But you somehow are still here talking about it. So yeah, should you start, Trisha?
Happy to open the floor. Thanks, guys, for the introduction. It's so lovely to be here with you all today. Some new faces, some old. It's a pleasure, honestly. So the question was, how did I come into the space? I first entered the SRM field through analyzing its potential impacts on climate extremes, and my focus was on stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI. And so my first bit of research kind of looked at like what SAI under different injection scenarios could mean for climate extremes in South Africa, and also what those changes could mean for systems in South Africa, for sectors and for humans. So I'm not sure if you guys remember earlier this morning, Babatunde mentioned that South Africa is a really water-stressed country, and so I tried to make my study a bit more contextually appropriate and try to have a look at, consider what changes under SRM could mean for water stress in the country. And so that's kind of the direction that I'm moving in now. I'd like to figure out how to link climate science with real lives. Sorry, what was the second half of your question? How did I come into the space? Oh, and then why I'm in it? Oh, so I'm in it because do you know what? the more I engage with early career researchers, like you guys, I feel like there's like a nice sense of community that's growing, and I recognize that we have some potential to shape where research goes, and I think we have that's both a responsibility and an opportunity that I'd like to be a part of. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Rachel. Thank you, Cody and Clara, for the introductions. So on that first question, how did I come to be in this space? I think like a lot of us, the conversation starts with the climate crisis and whether that be emotions of anxiety, fear, anger, and wanting to move through those emotions and do something that felt a bit more tangible, a bit more productive. During my honours year, I knew I always wanted to go into postgraduate study, but I wasn't exactly sure of the topic, but I knew I wanted it to be based somewhere in climate law or in climate law. But during my undergraduate studies, my background, at least working with other professors, was in space law. And I came across, doing my Googles, a paper by Chad Baum, Sean Lowe, and Benjamin Sovacool, to which I owe a great deal. It was called Between the Sun and Us, Expert Perceptions on Innovation Policy and Deep Uncertainties of Space-Based Solar Geoengineering. And what I owe is to, I can't remember what expert number it was, but one of the experts was quoted to say, why not? You could always just write a PhD dissertation on this sort of stuff. And that was the spark. From there, I emailed who are now my supervisors, saying, I've got an idea, which originally started with looking more at the legal governance side of space-based geoengineering, but has since evolved. But I guess that's how I ended up here, a fateful paper. And while I'm still here, well, I need to finish my PhD. Step one. But I'm still here because of conversations like this. It's really exciting to be part of a community that is energized and moving forward and doing so many different things. This morning in the plenary, hearing about 4 different things that I previously had maybe only seen very briefly. Hearing from all different communities has been such an important part of what we're doing this week, and I guess that's what's all keeping us here, is that need for community.
Yeah, thanks, Clara and Cody and Trisha and Rachel for your thoughts and introductions. Very happy to be here also. My name is Ellen Haaslahti, as Cody well said. And I'm going to share a bit about how I got into this space in my presentation. So just shortly, I was studying environmental sciences, and I was also active in the environmental movement, and just at some point learned about SRM, and then we saw with this group that I'm working with that in Finland nobody was actually talking about this or working with it. especially maybe the social side of things. So we saw this responsibility gap in a way and figured that we should see what's up and spread the awareness. And that's kind of like, that work still needs to be done a lot better and more. So that's kind of like what's keeping me here, in addition to the community. That's great.
Should I answer the question? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I originally got into SRM actually through meeting Operati Arctis in Iceland, and also I think you, Clara, were you at the Arctic Circle or something? Yeah, and Clara as well, and they were talking about this thing called stratospheric aerosol injection, and I was like, what is this? This is, wow. Because I was involved in environmentalism in Iceland, and it kind of shocked me that I hadn't heard of SRM or SAI before meeting them, and this was 2023 actually, sorry. Yeah, 2023. Losing track of time, you know, early career research is already getting old. But yeah, I was just, then started looking more into it and was like, wow, this is fascinating. This is something I should be a part of because this could like change the world. And I was, yeah, super worried about environmentalism and climate change. And so this just seemed like a really good space that not many people were talking about. Like Ellen said, there wasn't a lot of social scientists involved. And I still know of like only like a handful of other anthropologists who are actually working on this. So that's also why I've stayed in, just because I think, yeah, it's not very many people are talking about it, and a lot more people should, and especially from the social scientists, I think, but everybody, of course.
The year was 2019, and I I was just like Ellen involved with the environmental movement, more from an activist side of things, and I heard about a conference happening in Rio called the International Symposium on Climate Engineering, and I was like, what is this? I've never heard. And I remember going there, I was really shocked that no one was bringing civil society. I mean, it was about civil society, but without civil society in the room, and that's something that really annoyed me. And not just me, I think I was just shocked. I couldn't say anything, but lots of people complained that there was an angle of climate justice missing in those conversations, and it wasn't like a purely natural sciences seminar, so there was a gap that needed to be filled, and everyone in the room felt that the same. But I guess back in 2019, there wasn't still that urgency to talk about climate interventions. I think it was still something that was far off in the future, and that only a certain group of people should be looking into it. But I guess things started escalating after that, but that's how I got into, like, from this sense of shock and why is no one talking about it, and where can we go if we want to learn more about this. So yeah, but without further ado, I think we will start with Trisha with learning more about your work here in South Africa.
Cool, thank you guys for the introductions. It was really nice to hear your stories. I realized that I didn't tell you my story. So I'm going to tell you my story, and then I'm going to go back to tell you about my work. So I actually first learned about SRM 5 years ago. I had just started doing my master's in climate change and sustainable development here in Cape Town, at the University of Cape Town. And then Dr. Romerick Odelami, he presented about SRM to my class. And that was the first time I'd heard about it. I was very intrigued. So I emailed him the next day, and I asked him if he'd be open to supervising me, because it's a topic I'd like to explore. So that was it. And then I've basically been doing SRM work and gaining exposure to the field through the Degrees Initiative. And nobody else in my class was interested, which I found weird. I found it weird that no one was interested. But okay, let me go to the work now. So like I said just now, I started working on climate extremes and what that could mean for people, for systems in a contextually grounded perspective. And yes, I worked on a project, one in South Africa, and recently we applied a similar methodology to a project in Tanzania to explore what SRM could mean for climate extremes over the country's agroecological zones, and also what it could mean for some very important sectors in the country. So we looked at agriculture, because agriculture employs over 80% of Tanzania's population. And Tanzania has 2 rainfall seasons, and so we tried to make some connections and figure out whether less heat and more or less rain in this part of Tanzania versus this part of Tanzania could benefit particular types of agriculture. And then we did the same thing, for example, for tourism in the country, because Tanzania has quite a big nature-based tourism sector, and they have the Masai Mara, Mount Kilimanjaro, and so we looked at, oh my gosh, if there's less heat, what could that mean for tourism safety? And just real sorts of things like that, just to try make it a little bit more relatable and potentially a little more policy relevant in time to come. And then essentially through doing studies like this and asking questions from a contextually grounded perspective, I came to realize that in theory, if SRM were ever deployed, the changes would begin in the atmosphere, but those then ripple across human systems. So that's kind of what pulled me towards systems level analyses of SRM projections in light of real world socioeconomic systems, as well as ongoing development goals. And so because knowing how the climate might change is the starting point, I think we then need to ask for whom, where, and what could it mean for livelihoods, for health systems, food security, and lived realities in general. Yeah, so that's where we're at right now in terms of just trying to develop a bit of a framework for how we could link the science with the socioeconomics at a sectoral scale. And I think that in the field, something I've come to learn is that I think that climate intervention requires interdisciplinary approaches. That's really something that I just see and hear more and more of. And I think to ask more informed questions in SRM, I've been very fortunate to work across different domains like climate science, socioeconomics, and then also systems thinking. And so I've learned that interdisciplinarity is not an extra layer, but it could actually be a way to surface the risks and also the opportunities that matter on the ground. And I did a little bit of work that explored the intersection between SRM and global catastrophic risk. And so we the project was to figure out how risks could cascade following the occurrence of a catastrophic event, and if plausible pathways to termination shock exist against the backdrop of an SRM deployment scenario. And so in this process, we explored cascading impacts, and we've kind of looked at what could happen to global trade systems, to food systems, and what could these changes sort of mean for regional stability, geopolitics, and then just doing some systems thinking pushed me to ask where resilience lives and also how fragility compounds. So I think science alone can't answer those questions, and I think we need inputs from social science, from local knowledge, policy insights, and then also historical awareness as we do more research. And I think it's in the intersections that the most urgent SRM questions are hiding. And then I think that what could potentially be missing in the field a little bit is that there's a big gap, of course, as I've mentioned, between the science and the socioeconomics, so I won't go into that too much again. But I think there's a gap in leadership, So Global South researchers and stakeholders need not only more inclusion, but also to be involved in agenda setting. So I think that's important because some of us living in very high-risk regions or countries ask very different contextually grounded questions. And I think these questions often consider dimensions of justice, as well as present-day infrastructure, history, and access to resources. And I think if we want SRM research to inform policy, then it needs to be policy relevant. And so I think that means framing research in ways that match the realities of governments. So research should be a bit more layered, contextual, shaped by political history, resource constraints, and competing priorities. And so a justice-informed, context-aware research approach is potentially a way to go about that. And then I just want to talk a little bit about what being an early career researcher in the space right now feels like. I think the space is both exciting, but also a bit disorienting because the field is evolving at such a rapid pace. Even right now, in the different rooms, just in this building, the field is evolving through conversation, and I think it's becoming multidisciplinary, it's fast-moving, and it's still relatively small, right? And I think that gives us space to shape things as early career researchers, but also it means navigating uncertainty, siloed networks, and uneven access. So as someone based in Africa, I have also felt the geographic disconnects. Historically, most of the field's been centered in the global north, which means collaboration has been a bit fragmented along the way. But I guess the Degrees Initiative and communities like the Climate Intervention Network are working to fill this gap by creating safe spaces and communities for people like little old me at the bottom of Africa to engage in the conversation. Yeah, and I think in a nutshell, I think working in SRM is important because I don't think it's just about studying possible futures. I think it's about shaping them responsibly, collaboratively, and also with humility. We're not here just to model climate scenarios. I think we need to ask what kind of world we want to build. I think we need to ask how can knowledge serve justice? And I think that includes knowing when to act and also when not to act, who should be consulted, and what histories should be considered and remembered and integrated. And then lastly, I think as early career researchers, like I said not too long ago, we carry the responsibility and also the opportunity to shape a research culture that is inclusive, transparent, interdisciplinary, and grounded in lived realities, and a culture that is both technically sophisticated and also socially meaningful and just. So that's my little bit. Thank you.
Thanks, Trisha. It's good to take it over from here. I'm gonna have slides, and you know how to put them on. Maybe I would recommend if you're sitting here, I think you can see better if you move maybe that way. But you choose yourself. And I can already start by saying that very happy and honored to be here today with you, and nice to see so many people here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my master thesis on expert perceptions on SRM. Yes. And this is kind of like a study that I did with climate change experts in Finland, so it will represent a small take from a small country, but I hope we can work as a reflection point for other perceptions. So, like I said, I was very active in the environmental movement
for some years. This is from one of the demonstrations that I took part in, and this is basically where my journey with SRM also started. I got to know some really amazing active people there, and together we eventually learned about both the growing threat of climate tipping points and climate risks near term, and also the growing discussions around climate intervention. And like I said, we realized that no one in Finland was really talking about it, and we didn't know about it, and it seemed quite scary, but also something that is going to grow as a discussion. So in 2022, we founded Operaatio Artis, which is this climate strategy agency, to respond both to increasing climate risks and the low awareness and inaction around climate intervention research. And to this date, we have developed a lot more understanding around climate interventions from the perspectives of both indigenous peoples, the Sami in the Finnish side, and also natural and social sciences. And we've also learned how the space also within science is really polarized with different views. Scientists call for different scientific approaches, I think we all know that. And this is maybe very hard also for us as science communicators to think about what kind of approaches and communications do we choose to advocate for. And of course, these perceptions and narratives that scientists and experts use, they're very significant in also determining the public discussions and eventually policymaking. And this way, they're really relevant for foresight on SRM technologies and where they're going. So as a master's student in global sustainability, I wanted to understand better how experts think in my own country, in Finland. So I decided to study this in my master's thesis, and here you can see my questions. The objective of my work was to identify how multidisciplinary climate change experts in Finland perceive SRM research and deployment in the context of broader climate response strategies and goals. More specifically, we looked at SAI and MCB. And to answer my questions, I used a variation of a Delphi method. It's this foresight method. It kind of like resembles a survey, but is different by its dialogical nature. Briefly, some selected experts are invited to take part, and those who are willing to participate will form an expert panel, and the panel then answer to multiple choice questions anonymously. And what's the key thing is that they're also able to comment on an argument for their choices. And this way they can discuss about the questions, and also they can change their answers through the process. And just shortly, I had eventually 18 panelists, 11 men, 6 women, and 1 other, all highly educated. And these are the areas of expertise that were represented. Most of the experts came from research, but there are also other sectors represented. And 6 of these people work themselves with SRM, so there's a lot of variation with the familiarity with SRM also that, of course, influenced a lot my resources. And I will now share some of the key findings. We'll spend a bit more time with the first one, and then move on to the third one. So first, within this panel, the research activities, both on SIA and MCB, are really likely and desirable to increase in the future. And some key arguments for supporting research were that there's a need to increase scientific understanding to be prepared for different scenarios, such as considering deployment. And there was a repeating narrative about a business as usual scenario where we continue to warm the climate dangerously, to a point where either one actor or group decides to use climate or use SRM to alleviate the impacts, regardless whether there is enough scientific information available or not. And this was a common concern. And also there was many raised that the importance of just enhancing general climate science and improving climate models, and to kind of like respond to a general low familiarity. And then again, at the same time, of course, the large-scale SRM remains as an undesirable climate response surrounded by skepticism and uncertainty. This, of course, aligns with many previous research. And mostly the experts rejected SRM based on maybe other criteria than its potential effectiveness, like ethics and policy issues and lack of governance structures and lack of scientific understanding, and preferring other means of for decarbonization. However, many did not really explain their rejective attitudes towards deployment. Some panelists expressed that they agree with many others that large-scale deployment sounds undesirable. So this can indicate how it really matters what other scientists and experts, how they present their opinions and so on, because it's really like a socially constructive that way, the discussion. And here's just an illustration of these results. The red here stands for higher likelihood and desirability, and blue colors indicate lower likelihood and desirability. Green stands for neutral or unsure answers. And we can see that everyone viewed increasing indoor research for both SIA and MCB either likely or highly likely, and also the desirability was almost as high. And small-scale field experiments were also seen slightly more likely and desirable for MCB than SAI, but no one perceived indoor research or small-scale field experiments as unlikely or undesirable, apart from one panelist.
Ellen, can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
So you put together likelihood and desirability.
Yes, they're like LH and D.
So, I mean, you could see a case where someone would think, like, I mean, I think it's highly likely, but, you know, maybe not desirable.
Yeah.
So how would you
How would you tell how individual?
distinguish those? Yeah, right. If I thought something was highly likely but undesirable,
Yeah.
where would it land on this?
I could see it from the results, but it's not like maybe visible in this graph. Unfortunately, how like individual, if somebody has like indicated that way, but I'd say that was common for some questions. This is typical for the Delphi method to ask for likelihood and desirability of future events. Yeah, sorry, it's not very well represented, that one here. Yeah. Yes. And only a couple of panelists saw still a large-scale deployment as likely and desirable, as you can see, the red and orange parts here. Otherwise, it was perceived as unlikely or highly unlikely and undesirable. And here are some, or maybe one comment from one panelist that I think represents pretty well some of the arguments behind their attitudes. So the researchers see that there's an increasing momentum maybe with this science, and they think research efforts are really, really important. And on the other hand, again, lastly, they say that they're initially opposed to the deployment of these methods. I also kind of like behind this research attitudes, I wanted to understand what kind of risks are most relevant to these panelists. So I asked about, in a similar way, about the likelihood and desirability of different impacts coming from increasing research. And some shared concerns linked to the development, design, and scale of SRM technologies. And the biophysical side effects from SRM rose quite a lot of concerns and a general level regarding their unpredictable and transboundary nature. Some shared differing views regarding the temporality of SRM deployment and side effects, while others were skeptical about the potential of designing SRM methods that could be used on a large scale or long term. So you could see the variation of familiarity really affecting some of the answers here. And here are some of the examples that mostly the panelists saw it is likely and desirable, for example, that SRM will be normalized as a research topic. Then again, there was a lot of uncertainty with some points, for example, whether the role of SRM in planning responses to climate impacts strengthens. And maybe surprisingly, for example, the slippery slope argument, these experts saw that it would be pretty unlikely and undesirable to if we would see an uncontrolled deployment of these methods. But maybe this is typical more for the scientific culture in Finland, I don't know. And some of the arguments for these you can see here, but maybe I will just move on. And a part of these questions I also asked about whether they think that SRM research could reduce the motivation to promote emission reductions, so the so-called moral hazard. We know that that's a common concern in the field. In my study, these experts, as I've already said, they generally supported more funding and efforts to be targeted to SRM research, though at the same time some felt that maybe resources would be better spent on emission cuts and removals. And others were also concerned that maybe this would increase techno-optimism and delay emission mitigation efforts at the same time. Then again, it was also noted that politicians find their ways to delay also without excuses related to climate interventions. So that might explain these results a bit. And moving on to my second finding about preferred policy approaches. Just shortly, internationally coordinated and science-based regulation was preferred to more national, market-based and restrictive approaches, although there was a lot of variation with these ones. I'll let Rachel do more about the policy side of this, so I'm just going to move on quickly. Here you can just see that there are many colors, so a lot of variation between answers. So, and maybe there's one comment, the one below, that maybe enlightens why there's so much uncertainty. Is that someone said that they see that this is somewhat premature, which is why they gave little or no support to some of the policy options here. Overall, still the middle one here and the lowest one here were mostly supported, so organizing internationally to monitor research and development. So sharing information was seen important, but other approaches were dividing people more. And lastly, which I think is really important, I saw broad pessimism towards achieving sufficient level of decarbonization in time, and also equitable global governance. And this became evident when asking these experts about the likelihood and desirability of achieving Paris Agreement targets with using different combinations of response strategies. Clearly, emission cuts were most desirable and are most important, but according to these experts will not be enough to achieve the Paris Agreement goal and stay below 2 degrees of warming. And as you can see here, where the pessimism sort of comes from, some said that significant and rapid reduction of GHG emissions is unlikely. Technical carbon sequestration takes a lot of energy and is expensive, and I do not believe that SRM techniques will be seriously considered before the 2 degrees limit is exceeded. And another one also said that I gave a rather pessimistic answer So a lot of pessimism here, which I think really influences the way people see SRM in a bit mixed way. And some also said that their views on SRM might shift along with more information, but also worsening climate change. And I think this reveals an important ethical question of who can say when the climate impacts are bad enough to consider SRM as a climate response strategy. These experts, for example, recognized also that their own a lot lower vulnerability compared to other people and species. And meanwhile, we have some studies where we see that younger generations and the global south often experience more climate impacts and tend to be more open maybe to approaches like SRM. Simultaneously, the level of trust in global governance is lower in the global south. So clearly the vulnerability of one's position in terms of climate change and global governance dynamics influences the way they see SRM. That was the point here. And I'm moving on to wrap up. This is basically what came out of my study. The process model here tries to explain how expert perceptions are formed on solar radiation in this broader context of climate response strategies and goals. So there are 4 different dimensions that I found important here. And to sum up, the increased research on SRM here was seen important, and based on the arguments of these panels, the precautionary approach here was interpreted to support more SRM research to be prepared to an uncertain future. And you can see there are perceived signs of progress towards maybe more credible scientific debate on SRM within these scientists in Finland. But still the uncertainties around SRM methods and their impacts may explain the difficulty with these scientists to try to estimate the likelihood and desirable trajectories for SRM activities. So the sort of social technical imaginary about SRM is influenced by the perceived inherent complexity of the climate system, but also the pessimism towards achieving sufficient level of decarbonization. And which is interesting is that social technical imaginaries are usually seen as these visions of desirable futures. And I think it's evident that now we sort of see the future as very undesirable, maybe both without SRM and also with SRM. So it's important to dive deeper in a more nuanced discussion about what would now be more desirable than some other scenarios. Thanks. I hope I wasn't too long. Yeah. I'm not actually sure if how can I shut it down? Maybe, can I just leave some, maybe I just leave it.
I love a good declaration. All right, is that, oh gosh, very fancy. Is it still morning? Is it still good morning, or are we in the good afternoon? We're in the good morning phase still? All right, lovely. My name is Rachel Neef. I'm a PhD student. I live and work on Kaurna land at the University, well, I don't live at the University of Adelaide, though some days it feels like it. But living and working on Kaurna land within the Adelaide Law School at the University of Adelaide. Before I get into, I guess, a bit more of the substance, I do want to take a moment to express my gratitude not only to Cody and Clara for bringing me onto this panel, but also to Degrees more generally for creating a space for early career researchers. It is often the case that we are chasing after our professors to piggyback on their grants or piggyback on their funding, while at the same time trying to carve out our own niche. So it's been real. I'm really grateful to be able to stand up and talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing. Not without them, but my own little piece of research. One thing that Cody and Clara, also wanted us to speak about is a little bit about working as an ECR in the SRM space. We love an acronym. And while we don't have a lot of time, I do want to start off with a little story, which did involve me jumping off a 216-metre bridge about 3 or 4 days ago. When thinking about being in Cape Town and sharing my research, which for the better part of 2 years had been my own, just between me and my supervisors, it was my own little thing, I got quite nervous. And so I thought, what better way to stop being nervous than to do something that was even more scary? Hence the decision to do a bungee jump. Now, I like to think I was very cool, calm, and collected. I'll show you the video. I think Kate saw it yesterday. I absolutely was not. Whilst on that platform, I was fine up until that last metre. And as I inched myself towards it, I was saying, no, 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 no. There was a person either side of me, and they were saying, yes, 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 yes. And they slowly, slowly pushed me towards the end. And despite my protests, 3, 2, 1, bungee, off I went. And so when I was back on solid ground, though, I was incredibly grateful. I could not thank them enough for pushing me to do something that I otherwise would not have been able to do. And now I may not have needed the bungee jumping story to make the point that sometimes as an ECR, you do need that push to get your research out there. But I think I need some mileage out of that experience, so I'll share it with you all today. This week, we're bringing together not just a range of voices from Global North and Global South, but also, at least for this session, a range of voices across different stages of their career. And I think that will be a great part of how we continue research in this space, making sure we have capacity building going forward. So my research, I introduced it slightly at the start. One paper that said maybe just do a PhD on this sparked the genesis of my PhD. But instead of looking at just the governance of space-based geoengineering, I decided instead to look at what lessons we can gather from space law that might be instructive for future SRM governance. SRM and space activities both have somewhat similar, though obviously not completely overlapping interests, in that they both take place in a global commons, they carry a wide range of actors, and must consider environmental and security considerations amongst others. So I'm hoping that from that rich body of space law, we may be able to draw lessons for a future SRM regime. As a bit of self-promotion, I recently published what was most of my literature review in the Review of European Comparative and International Environmental Law. So if anyone's looking for some bedtime reading, you can check that out. And later this week, I'll be presenting on how space law governs private activities and what we might learn from that for SRM. But given we have a bit more of a general audience here today, I won't take you through the joys of the Outer Space Treaty and our various other conventions. Instead, I've been asked to just share a little bit about international law and governance of SRM. So in 1996, Daniel Bodansky posed the question, quite politely, may we engineer the climate? And over the past 30 years or so, international legal scholars have continued to expand on this question to look at what international law we currently have and what, if any, boundaries it places on SRM. Spoiler alert, not many. For the most part, international legal scholars and others examined both binding and non-binding legal instruments to see what could apply or might be adopted for SRM. And though there has been some change since 1996, for the past maybe 10 years or so, the international legal landscape has been largely in a holding pattern. There's not a lot that's moving forward. We're waiting for something more concrete, or the political will to turn into some form of agreement. So I don't want to spend too much time rehashing old ground and going through all these lovely but somewhat boring treaties. There's many book chapters. I'd recommend Jesse Reynolds. That was my monograph. Sorry, your monograph was what my PhD supervisor handed me day one. So, yes, so it was Karen, yes. So big chapter on international law and SRM in there if anyone's interested. But the key takeaway is that there is no binding mechanism that directly regulates SRM. The 2010 Convention of Biological Diversity passed their COP decision in 2010 and has since been affirmed. And it provides, and I will just read it out, no climate-related geoengineering activities that may affect biodiversity take place until there is an adequate scientific basis on which to justify activities and appropriate consideration of the associated risks for the environment and biodiversity and associated social, economic and cultural impacts, with the exception of small-scale scientific research studies. And there's a little bit at the end. I know that was a bit long, but I thought I'd just share it in full just because the CBD can oftentimes, in a bit of haste, we can dismiss it as a bit of a de facto moratorium. And whilst the provision is restrictive, it does no mean outright ban all geoengineering activities. And again, it is a non-binding decision. That doesn't mean it's not influential, it just means it's not theoretically an obligation. In 2021, the International Law Commission published their draft guidelines on the protection of the atmosphere, and that provided that activities aimed at the intentional large-scale modification of the atmosphere should only be conducted with prudence and caution and subject to any applicable rules of assessment, applicable rules of international law, including those relating to environmental impact assessment. So these instruments, like I said, are still influential. However, they don't have any binding force, and they also fall short of any kind of comprehensive, effective, substantial governance of SRM. So instead, the question that scholars often turn to was how could we adapt existing legal instruments to bring SRM into their frame? So this looked like questions of investigating treaties that were specific to geographical areas like the ozone regimes, outer space, law of the sea, Antarctica, and see what we could maybe grab from those treaties that could be adapted for SRM. And then also whether specific substances involved in SRM, particularly for SAI, and how that would implicate the Ozone Convention. But all of these questions were answered with that we just have a patchwork of SRM governance. There's parts that might potentially apply to certain activities depending on how you want to interpret a treaty, but there was nothing that was strong. And so those calls for international governance remain because of the transboundary, regional, or even global impacts that we've all heard of. However, there's at the same time a general pessimism about the capacity of international law to address these challenges. To quickly turn to the latest international efforts on SRM, I think the big one was the 2024 UNEA decision, or lack thereof. And I'm going to quickly draw on some pieces by Duncan McLaren and Olive Corey, who are observing at UNEA and have since published a few pieces about their observations. One thing that was interesting about those observations is the push for scientific governance, or scientific research, particularly by the US and before governance. And so calling for science-based approaches on SRM, initially the US favoured the IPCC in 2019. I don't think they liked the sixth assessment report because instead they then pushed in 2024 for the World Climate Research Programme as a place for discussions. Calls for science-based approaches inherently favour one type of knowledge over others. I'm sure we're all here because we like an interdisciplinary focus. But it's also important to remember that more science does not always mean better decisions. We've seen that not only in the climate space, and I don't want to invoke the ghost of COVID, but science is not the only answer. We also need science communication. The other thing I want to quickly mention, and this is something Ellen touched on as well, was how precaution was viewed in that forum. A lot of scientists and experts, we see the role of precaution as learning about SRM because of the uncertainty of the climate crisis, whereas in that forum, states in UNEA, states sceptical of SRM took precaution to SRM. Corey and McLaren writing that the delegates applied precaution to SRM itself rather than seeing it as a possible precautionary tool to tackle climate change. And so we need to be aware of how those different communities are seeing something that is essentially the same word, precaution. This also, again, calls in the need for not just science communication, but it may be a shift away from purely scientific management. We're seeing different governance theories, adaptive governance, anticipatory governance, risk governance, earth system governance, all trying to tackle SRM, and all of these governance theories, while have science as a key component, have other factors like public participation, multi-scalar institutions, conflict resolution as key pillars alongside science. What does this mean is next for international law and governance? Like I said, we're in a bit of a holding pattern. Yesterday, Pascal Lamy spoke about potentially putting forward a coalition of the willing and moving towards a moratorium on deployment. And what this means, sorry, I don't know what that means exactly, we're not sure what it looks like. Two things probably to be aware of, and something that people have highlighted, is to be very cautious distinguishing between a non-use agreement and a non-deployment agreement and what that looks like. And the other question that comes out, and it came out yesterday, is how do we then prevent some rogue actor from going outside a moratorium? And unfortunately, international law is not a silver bullet. The hurdle of working in international law is my first question that is often posed to me is international law real? It's just made up. And yes, it only exists to the extent that states consent to its obligations and states consent to enforcing those obligations. But that does not mean that it's irrelevant. We've seen recent quite flagrant violations of international law, but we know that states still speak in the language of law and they still regard it as important when making their decisions. So just because it's not perfect doesn't mean it can't be useful. And just conscious of time, I think I might wrap up with just by saying there is plenty of law that technically could apply to SRM, but none of it's really going to help in making any key decisions. What our conversation needs to do now is moving beyond this and looking at how we can operationalise some kind of governance. And I think a really key question for us is looking at what forum we think that is most appropriate in, whether that be a big multilateral body which is plagued by indecision often, or whether we move forward with a smaller group of states, a club or a coalition, at the risk of maybe excluding some voices. All right, thank you.
All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. I learned a lot. As a social scientist, I was like, wow, so much to learn. And yeah. And just to start off with, I've prepared a couple of questions for the panelists to follow up, and then we'll open up to the audience for questions for the panelists as well. Just to start with Tricia, I'm really curious about your interdisciplinary approach and your calls for that. I was just wondering, in your own experience, what are the biggest difficulties or challenges in sort of approaching SRM interdisciplinarily and, for example, in understanding or combining social economic impacts with like natural observations?
Thank you for that question. It's a great one because there isn't a way to do it. It doesn't really exist. So I guess I can give you a bit more information about it. So what I'm trying to do with a couple of members from my team at the University of Cape Town is that we're trying to work together to build a framework that does just that SRM researchers can use they can apply it to figure out what projected climate changes under SRM might mean for whichever region or country they're looking at, or the socioeconomics of that area. And the idea so far is to make use of socioeconomic indicators like poverty indexes, population density, census data, data sources like that, and then to make use of existing literature that is relevant to the context you're looking at. And so it's in its infancy. I can't say much more than that, but we're building on work that we've done previously in what the papers I spoke about earlier about SRM's impacts in South Africa and Tanzania. So that's the base for it, essentially.
All right. And then, for Ellen, sorry. I noticed in your presentation, the experts didn't seem to make very many references to, say, like Finland's regional or like climatic conditions, other than to say that Finland is potentially less vulnerable, or they're less vulnerable than other people. But since I also work in the Arctic and subarctic, I was wondering if there were responses that referenced, because I know also you're working opera at the Arctic, you mentioned the Arctic and the subarctic and the impact of climate change on melting ice and glaciers. So I was wondering if that was a factor and they mentioned that in the discussions, or if they didn't, were you surprised that they didn't talk more about melting ice and things like that?
Yeah, it's true. They didn't talk about that so much. Let me think. I think the biophysical impacts and concerns were expressed on a more general level. And I had a question where I asked the panelists to reflect how vulnerable do they think they themselves are, their living area, and then like overall how concerned are they about climate change and different dimensions of impacts. And there I think they reflected that, or it was really clear that they were more concerned for like global impacts and impacts elsewhere. But I do think that that's a factor that they would also be concerned about, the melting ice and so on. And some people also discussed, for example, the tipping points and like increasing climate risks that we need to respond to in some way. And that was maybe something that pushed them towards being more open to SRM research, basically. But that's a really interesting area that should be studied more.
Great, thank you. And for Rachel, I'm just curious, I don't know a lot about anticipatory governance, but thinking about this as an early career researcher panel, I was thinking, and as young people, what do you think can anticipatory governance help address the issues of intergenerational justice when it comes to SRM? And what are sort of some of the challenges maybe facing some sort of anticipatory governance framework?
I think I'll start off with saying that there is a lot of governance theory, anticipatory governance, adaptive governance, various forms of governance, and sometimes we use the adjective of what type of governance is in a general sense, and sometimes it has a very specific theory attached behind it. And so we just need to be cognizant of how we're using those words, because otherwise you can delve into a big body of literature that you weren't intending to. And I think there are a lot of conversations at the moment about what type of governance we need for SRM. Is it something that is anticipatory? Or is it something that is adaptive? Is it something that involves risk and risk management? All of these theories at their heart have a desire for science and a desire for monitoring and iterative learning, a desire for public participation in some forum, and multi-scale institutions. So there are common threads across all these governance approaches, and to some extent also including conflict management. So I think there would be some people who really do want to stick in one governance theory. I don't think we need to necessarily corner that off at this point, and it's worth exploring all of them, and particularly where there are so many interconnections between each theory. What was the second part of the question? Challenges about being an ECR? Oh, yeah, okay. Well, I think then because all of these governance theories relate in some ways to needing iterative learning, whichever one we choose has a space to continue to create flexible instruments and to make sure that we adapt laws or governance in relation to what we learn. And so, yeah, that's the, I guess, big challenge of balancing something that is concrete, which gives certainty, with something that is less concrete that gives flexibility as those new challenges come about.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I think we can open it to the audience now for questions. There's microphones that will be coming around. Yeah.
Hi everyone. Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Yeshis from the University of Cambridge, and my question is, I guess, yeah, we're all young, right? But the question I had was, in your experience or perspective, what is kind of the ideal forum to host like an intergenerational collaboration in the context of SRM? Because like global convenings like COP are just there's a lot of tokenization of youth, and especially someone who's looking at it from a scientific perspective. It's also, like if you are young and in science, you don't have the same kind of weight compared to someone who's older. But I guess that the question is there an ideal forum to host intergenerational collaboration or conversations on SRM?
In this room is the perfect forum. No, I'm kidding. Anyone want to take this?
I think we don't have an answer yet. It might be up to us to build this, because we shouldn't be expecting those who are already the expert voices in science to make the space for early careers. I think we would have to meet halfway. And maybe this week here at Degrees is a great way to I don't know, incentivize this collaboration. Because we also can't work in silos, right? We can't have the early careers convenings always and the experts convenings. I do think it's important to have the, not division, but like having a space for us early careers. But for that collaboration itself, I think we should push for that instead of waiting for them to offer us more opportunities.
I'm going to be such a lawyer here and be such a stickler for a definition. I think one thing that we need to think about when we talk about intergenerational justice is it's not just the generations that are here now. And so while we need to include ECRs and the younger generation of people who are in science and working in this field in those conversations, intergenerational justice by its nature requires us to think about future generations. And so while, yes, we all need to have a space at the table, we need to be thinking forward beyond just our own little sector. And that's not to say that you're not. That's just me being a stickler for a definition.
Do you know what? I think that one, like an important role that ECRs can play in this conversation about intergenerational justice is that I think as ECRs we have long-term, deeper future stakes, and so I think that the questions we asked today are sort of a reflection of more contextual priorities that we have for the long term, and like if you want to have kids and whatnot, that kind of those sorts of things. And so I think we do have a role to play in ensuring that long-term governance structures do reflect in future intergenerational or youth priorities.
Jesse Reynolds from the Degrees Initiative. So first, this is clearly a very encouraging development. So hats off to DSG for assembling and launching the Climate Intervention Network for Early Career Researchers. But as Tricia brought up, she was brought into SRM through a talk that one of our funded researchers gave, Romaric. And so although fostering the next cohort of scholars in the Global South is not at the heart of what we do, it should certainly be a component of what we do. And the reason that I made a point of coming to this session today is I'd like to know, what can Degrees do? Our primary business is building capacity in the Global South, broadly defined. But as time goes on, we do need that next cohort. So I can imagine some possibilities, such as encouraging our grantees to have components where they give talks to master's students, where they have 1 or 2 master's theses as part of their research projects. Maybe they can offer a master's level class and even possibly have have grants dedicated to that purpose. But if anybody has any suggestions about what we could do with our modest funds, but they're there to support the research institutions in the Global South, do let me know now or anytime this week.
One reflection to that, I definitely agree with everything you said. Maybe in addition to engaging with students and universities, it might be worthwhile to also engage with local environmental movements, because usually there's people who are really who have understanding about the environmental crisis and deeply care about it. So there might also be people who are able to spread the knowledge, and they also interact with academia. So that can be also something to look at. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think since I work a lot in public perception and engagement, I think it is, and I've worked in environmental activism in the past. I'm still in environmental activist groups. I think they're just as interested in these topics and perhaps a bit more wary sometimes, but that's all the more reason to engage in conversations with them and also try to involve them in learning about the research, because I think it's a lot of the resistance or sort of, yeah, comes as we learned a lot in Ellen's presentation, is from that uncertainty, and to lower the uncertainty among, yeah, everybody, NGOs, they need to be hearing the conversations, especially youth. With my own, like, sort of, just to reflect very briefly, but like I also heard when I was at the Arctic Circle Assembly in 2023, there was ongoing experiments with glacier albedo modification through the Bright Ice Initiative. And it really shocked me that I hadn't heard of it, because I was a member of a youth environmental group and we were, you know, quite visible. People knew about us, but we would never approached and said, hey, this is what we're doing in your country, that, you know, we are trying to protect the environment of. So I think, yeah, it's all about really trying to talk to as many groups as possible, both in the public and elsewhere.
Just one more thing. I think the early career researchers we have now, we're somehow lucky that we had the opportunity not only to meet professors who would take us in, but also to have funded opportunities to do a PhD or a master's. And I think that's something that the degrees could help, having like targeted funding for early career researchers, because I mean, talks for master students and in high schools, they're needed. Like, that's something that we also do. But for those who want to remain engaged in this topic, we don't have many opportunities. So like Tricia said, she was the only one that was interested in her class, but she also had the chance to keep on working, right? If she was just interested but couldn't have a specific position, then like you miss the opportunity of retaining the interested early careers.
Yeah, and I think that's extremely important, considering the sort of, yeah, these sort of uncertainties and the controversies of SRM, or how it can be, because like for myself, I've you know, have had a lot of uncertainties of, should I keep talking about this? Should I keep in this space? Because especially as an early career researcher, we're vulnerable. So maybe, yeah, I don't know if it would limit my career options in the future. I mean, I've, yeah, had some interesting emails from other academics at my institution and elsewhere who were like, yeah, not the most kind, I think, or understanding or empathetic. And so, yeah, there's definitely been a lot of times where I'm like, should I continue in this space? And I think, because I think having the support of an organization, especially if you have funding, that makes it, yeah, a lot easier to continue despite any misgivings. So I just want to underline that as well. Next question.
Maybe, yeah, to the other researchers in the room, do you see a clear research question that we haven't been asking yet, and that we should have more people looking into it? Or Tricia brought up a lot the point of this is a very interdisciplinary conversation and research as well, right? But we're not experts in both social sciences and natural sciences. So is there also something that you would like more people who are not from your field of work to look into?
Humanizing research in SRM, because I think the idea of SRM is so scary to a lot of people that it's just like vilified immediately. And then we've kind of, as Cody said, we've kind of tied our careers to this dying, horse. Except, you know, I mean, it's a, you know, visceral image, but I guess the idea is that, like, yeah, like, can we humanize this scary idea to make it not seem like we're the evil people?
Can I just add to that? Which I think in doing that and humanizing it, like how there seems to be a real issue with sort of a conflation of doing research into these things, which can be very objective and critical research that may show that it's a bad thing to do, versus like, so supporting that research and wanting to do that research versus wanting to do, like, advocating for SRM approaches, which are two very different things. So I don't know how you can, I feel like part of the humanization would need to be getting people to understand that distinction.
No, I agree completely. Yeah. I think just that nuance is lost a lot of times, and it almost feels like it's like kind of like a cop-out to be like, oh, no, I'm just
do think the fault in that partly falls with the researchers who sometimes don't do very well at communicating and sound like advocates for doing SRM versus understanding it, yeah.
Yes, Annelot from Delft University in the Netherlands. So to add to that, I'm thinking, so I'm a PhD student now, and like your primary goal of, like is to publish papers on your research. You need to focus on that in some way. But I think especially in this field of research, it should also be like maybe the secondary or even primary goal to communicate about it, because yeah, then only then people will really understand why you are working on it. So I think it would be nice if the more senior researchers would acknowledge that in this field of research we really need dedicated time and funding for the science communication, especially when you're a young researcher. So yeah.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Temi Tokwe, and I'm currently doing my PhD, first year PhD at the University of Cape Town. So I'm trying to help us understand from this particular notion that we are not trying to sell SRM to people, like we're selling a product. Maybe from a scientific point of view, I don't know how soil scientists we communicate it, but what we do is to help people understand the potential benefits, the potential risk or trade-off in using SRM. So we should try to understand this from this view, not like we are trying to sell SRM. You must believe. I don't know if you get my point. So let us put that into our perspective whenever we are communicating this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up there. But if you have more questions, comments, concerns, or anything, there is a dinner for the Climate Intervention Network tonight at 8:30. We have a WhatsApp group, so you can approach Clara after this, and she can add you to the WhatsApp group where you can find the details. And she can also add you to the Slack community for the network, so you can stay in touch and attend the great events that she's organized and set up. So thank you for coming, and yeah, hopefully see you tonight.